All right, so are you ready to, like, take a trip back in time with me today? We're going deep, deep, deep into the mystery of Jack the Ripper.
Oh, a classic.
A classic. I mean, I think, like, most people have at least heard the name Jack the Ripper, but I think today we're gonna really go beyond just the headlines and, like, really get into it.
Yeah.
So to do that, I've got some really interesting sources, a bunch of Wikipedia articles, and a YouTube video.
Nice.
So we're gonna unpack, like, all of it. The historical context, the victims, the investigation, all the crazy theories that still kind of swirl around this case over 100 years later. I think it's gonna be really interesting.
I think so too. What gets me with Jack the Ripper is that we have to remember the setting, like Whitechapel in 1888, wasn't just a backdrop. It really was a character in this story.
Okay, so paint me a picture. Like, what was life actually like in Whitechapel?
Okay, so imagine, if you will, just a district completely teeming with people, and most of them are struggling to survive,
Hmm.
overcrowded, impoverished, and we're talking a 55% child mortality rate.
Oh my gosh.
The sources say 55% of children in the East End didn't make it to their 5th birthday.
Wow, that's intense. That really puts it into perspective.
It was a perfect storm of social tensions. You had Irish fleeing famine, Jewish refugees escaping persecution, and they're all competing for these super scarce resources.
Right.
And for many women, tragically, the only way that they could make ends meet was through prostitution, which tragically made them very, very vulnerable to someone like Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, it's chilling to think about how those circumstances played right into the Ripper's hands.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the victims, the canonical five, as they're often called. But we need to remember that these were real women with their own lives and stories. They weren't just statistics in a true crime case.
Absolutely. And their murders, while they are terrifyingly similar, each of them had very unique details that just kind of add to this complex puzzle.
Yeah, so let's try to like walk through the timeline a little bit. So first, there was Marianne Nichols on August 31st, 1888.
Right. Her body was found in Buck's Row. Her throat was slashed and her abdomen was mutilated. It was just a brutal attack that immediately sent shockwaves through Whitechapel.
And then just a week later, on September 8th, we have Annie Chapman.
Yes, Annie Chapman. She was found in the backyard of a tenement on Hanbury Street. But this time, there was a new detail. Some of her belongings were arranged neatly at her feet, almost like a signature.
Oh, wow. That's really unsettling.
It is.
Yeah.
And the level of violence also escalated. Her abdomen was completely ripped open, and her intestines were placed over her shoulder. It was just a level of brutality that went beyond just the need to kill.
Like the killer was becoming more confident, more aware of the fear that he was generating.
Maybe.
Okay, and then things get even more intense, right, with the double event on September 30th.
Yeah, a night that truly gripped Whitechapel in terror.
Totally.
So first you have Elizabeth Stride. She was found in Dutfield's yard.
Okay.
Now, her throat was cut, but there were no other mutilations. Yeah, so it's possible that the killer was interrupted.
Oh, okay.
And then just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square.
Wow, 45 minutes later.
Yes. And this murder was by far the most gruesome yet.
Gosh.
Her throat was slashed, her abdomen ripped open, her intestines placed over her shoulder, and a portion of her ear was actually severed.
Oh my God.
It seemed to suggest a terrifying escalation in the Ripper's modus operandi, a really frenzied attack.
To think all of this happened within such a small area in such a short span of time, I mean, it must have felt like the killer was closing in, like nowhere was safe.
Absolutely. I mean, the sources describe a city that was paralyzed by fear. Every shadow held a potential threat, and the inability of the police to catch the killer only amplified that terror.
So let's talk about the investigation.
No.
It seems like the police were facing like a truly uphill battle right from the start.
Oh, for sure. Imagine, like, trying to solve a murder in 1888.
Right.
You know, forensics were in their infancy. Fingerprinting wasn't widely used. There was no DNA analysis. So the police relied heavily on witness statements, which were very often unreliable or completely contradictory.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, the sources mentioned a criticism from back then that the police were playing blind man's buff. Do you think that's fair?
It's easy to judge with the benefit of hindsight, but yeah, I mean, the police were truly overwhelmed. Hundreds of potential suspects, this crazy media frenzy that just added to the chaos, and a public that's desperate for answers. It was a pressure cooker situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, citizens who are basically taking the law into their own hands. What was their role in all of this?
Well, they were a symptom, really, of the growing frustration with what was perceived as police inaction. So they patrolled the streets, hoping to catch the Ripper or at least deter him. But their presence probably just added to the overall sense of paranoia.
So while the police are trying to make sense of the clues, you have this vigilante group adding another layer of complexity to the whole situation. Sounds like a recipe for chaos.
Oh, yeah, it definitely complicated things. And amidst all this, you had one figure who tried to bring some order to the investigation. That was Dr. Thomas Bond.
Right, the police surgeon. He examined the bodies and provided one of the earliest criminal profiles. What did he have to say about the Ripper?
Bond believed that the killer was a solitary individual, possibly suffering from what they called back then satyriasis. We might consider it a form of hypersexuality now.
Okay.
He also stated that he didn't think that the killer was a surgeon, despite the precise removal of organs.
That's interesting. So even at this early stage, they were trying to, like, piece together a psychological profile.
Yeah.
But of course, without a suspect, it was all just speculation.
Totally, exactly. And then you have the letters.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds of them that poured into the police, supposedly from Jack the Ripper himself.
This is where things get really interesting. Like, we're talking about the infamous Dear Boss letter and the saucy Jackie postcard, right?
Yeah, those letters captivated the public and the press. They seem to offer this glimpse into the mind of the killer, but their authenticity has always been debated.
Were they like genuine communications from the Ripper or just elaborate hoaxes?
Most experts think that the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie letters were likely hoaxes, possibly written by a journalist just to keep the story in the headlines. But there's one letter, the From Hell letter, that takes things to a whole new level of disturbing. It was sent to George Lusk, the leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and it arrived with a small box.
Oh, wow.
Inside, half a preserved human kidney.
Hold on, like a real kidney.
A doctor examined it and confirmed it was human, but he couldn't definitively link it to Catherine Eddowes, who was missing her left kidney.
Right.
So was it like a gruesome trophy from the Ripper or a horrific prank to just stoke the flames of fear? I mean, we still don't know.
Either way, that's a chilling detail that just adds another layer to this case.
Absolutely.
And what about the letter itself? Like, did it offer any real clues?
The writer claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of the kidney.
Oh, my God.
Truly grotesque detail, but again, the handwriting and the style differed from the other letters, so it's difficult to definitively attribute it to the Ripper.
It's like someone was playing this, like, twisted game, feeding off the terror and notoriety surrounding the case.
Exactly, and the media frenzy around the Ripper murders was unlike anything that had been seen before.
Right.
Newspapers were filled with these sensationalized accounts, often embellishing the details or even fabricating stories
Oh, wow.
to sell more copies.
It seems like the Ripper case was like a turning point in how crime was reported, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It was the first case to generate a worldwide media frenzy. The combination of the brutal nature of the crimes, the mystery surrounding the killer, and the public's fascination with the case, it just made it a global sensation.
So in a way, Jack the Ripper became like a media icon, a symbol of terror and intrigue.
Precisely, and that in itself is a fascinating aspect of this case. Like, how much of what we know about Jack the Ripper is based on fact, and how much is a product of speculation, rumor, and media hype. It's almost impossible to separate the two at this point.
Which, of course, is part of the reason why we're still talking about it over a century later.
Exactly.
It's a puzzle with missing pieces.
Yeah.
And everybody has their own theory about how those pieces fit together.
Right. Speaking of theories, let's delve into some of the suspects.
Okay.
The sources highlight 3 in particular: Charleslechmere, Joseph Barnett, and Aaron Kazinsky.
Yeah.
Each with their own set of intriguing circumstances.
So, let's start with Charleslechmere, also known as Charles Cross.
Okay.
What makes him a suspect?
Lechmere, or Cross, was actually one of the first people to discover Marianne Nicholas's body,
Oh, wow.
and he testified at the inquest,
Okay.
but it seems he gave a false name.
Why would he do that? Was he trying to hide something?
That's the million-dollar question. Records show that his real name was Charles Lechmere, and that he sometimes went by his stepfather's name, Cross.
Okay.
Was this just a simple habit or a deliberate attempt to obscure his identity?
Okay, so already a bit suspicious.
Right.
What else links him to the crimes?
So his work route and schedule aligned with some of the murders, except for Stride and Eddowes,
Okay.
who were killed on a Sunday,
Right, the double event.
his day off.
Okay.
However, his mother lived near Burner Street, where Stride was found.
Oh, interesting. So maybe he visited his mother that Sunday night, which would explain the double event.
It's a theory that some researchers have put forward.
Makes sense.
Additionally, there are no existing records of his employment at Pickford's, the company he claimed to work for. Was this a fabricated alibi? The questions surrounding Lechmere just keep piling up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a potential motive for Stride and Eddowes,
Yeah.
a work schedule that lines up with the other victims, and a possibly fabricated alibi.
Right.
Definitely enough to raise some eyebrows. So let's move on to Joseph Barnett. What's his connection to the case?
Barnett was Mary Jane Kelly's live-in lover, but they had recently broken up.
Okay.
Some believe that he was enraged by her return to prostitution and killed her in a fit of jealous rage.
A crime of passion.
Potentially.
Okay.
And some theorize that he continued killing other prostitutes to scare Kelly off the streets, even though they had already broken up.
A twisted kind of logic, but I guess not entirely implausible.
Right, and there were witnesses who placed him at Miller's Court on the night of Kelly's murder. However, he did have an alibi, and the locked door at Kelly's room further complicates things.
So was the door genuinely locked from the inside, or did Barnett stage it to throw off the investigation?
It's another detail that adds to the intrigue, but doesn't offer a definitive answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot to unpack, but let's talk about that final suspect, Aaron Kazinsky.
Okay.
He seems to be like a favorite amongst all the Ripper theorists.
Kazinsky was a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and had even threatened his sister with a knife at one point.
Oh, wow.
He was later committed to an asylum.
So a mentally unstable individual residing right in the heart of Whitechapel.
Right.
Seems like a pretty strong lead.
On the surface, yes.
Okay.
However, the sources also point out some significant inconsistencies.
Okay.
Some police officers claim that Kazinsky was committed to the asylum earlier than records indicate, and they also reported that he died shortly after being committed, which is demonstrably false.
Oh, wow.
He actually lived for several more decades.
So some serious doubt is cast on the timeline and the reliability of those initial police reports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the infamous DNA evidence linked to Kazinsky, a blood-stained shawl supposedly taken from the Eddowes crime scene.
Right.
But the science behind it is shaky at best.
Thank.
Mitochondrial DNA, which they used,
Yeah.
can't pinpoint an individual. It can only narrow down the possibilities to a maternal lineage.
So another dead end, at least in terms of like definitive proof.
Yeah, I mean, we have these three compelling suspects, Lechmere, Barnett, and Kazinsky.
Right.
But no smoking gun for any of them.
Yeah, just a web of circumstantial evidence and all those tantalizing clues.
It's a classic whodunit scenario.
For sure.
And amidst all the speculation about the Ripper's identity, there's another layer to this case that we need to consider.
You're talking about the social and historical context, right? How the Ripper's crimes really expose that dark underbelly of Victorian society.
Exactly. The Whitechapel murders weren't just these isolated acts of violence. They were a symptom of a much larger problem.
Right.
The appalling living conditions in the East End.
The poverty, the overcrowding, the lack of sanitation.
Right. It all created this breeding ground for crime and despair.
And it's important to remember, too, that the Ripper's victims were among the most vulnerable members of society, right?
Absolutely.
Women who were forced into prostitution due to poverty and lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
Their lives and their deaths really reflect the harsh realities of life in Whitechapel in 1888.
It's true.
It's a stark reminder that sometimes the most horrific crimes can expose societal ills that might otherwise remain hidden.
Absolutely. And in the aftermath of the Ripper murders, there was this push for social reform.
Yeah.
Public outcry forced the authorities to actually address the squalor of the slums, and it led to improved housing and sanitation in the decades that followed.
So in a way, the Ripper's crimes, as horrific as they were, became a catalyst for positive change.
It's a complex and unsettling legacy, but it's important to acknowledge both the darkness and the light that emerged from this period of history.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the suspects, the victims, the social context.
Right.
But there's another element to this case that continues to fuel speculation. Conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting. We're talking about Freemasons, royal cover-ups, even a connection to the royal family itself.
Okay, so now we're venturing into the realm of speculation and conjecture. Like, what are some of the most popular theories that are out there?
Well, one theory suggests that the Ripper was a high-ranking Freemason,
Okay.
and the murders were part of some elaborate ritual or cover-up. Another one claims that the Ripper was actually Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson.
Wait, hold on. A member of the royal family as a serial killer? I mean, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and there's no real evidence to support it.
Right.
But the theory persists, fueled by this idea that the royal family would go to great lengths to protect one of their own.
Right. Okay, and what about the cover-up?
Yeah.
Was there any evidence to suggest that the police were deliberately hindering the investigation?
The sources don't offer any concrete proof of a cover-up, but there are some intriguing details.
Okay.
Remember the Jews graffito found near Edo's apron?
Right. The anti-Semitic message that seemed to implicate Jewish people in the murders.
Well, the police commissioner at the time, Sir Charles Warren, he ordered the graffito to be erased before dawn.
Why would he do that?
He claimed he was worried that it would spark anti-Semitic riots.
Okay.
But some people see this as evidence that the police were trying to suppress a clue that pointed to a more powerful suspect.
Oh, interesting.
Perhaps someone who was connected to the royal family.
So instead of following the lead, they just wiped it clean? Literally.
Exactly.
That's pretty suspicious.
It is, and it feeds into this whole conspiracy theory narrative.
Right.
This idea that the truth about Jack the Ripper was deliberately buried to protect those in power.
It's fascinating how these theories take on a life of their own, even without any concrete evidence.
It's true.
It's like we're wired to find patterns and connect the dots,
Yeah,
even if those connections are based on just speculation and conjecture.
exactly. We crave these narratives, explanations that make sense of the chaos.
Right.
And when those explanations involve powerful figures and secret societies, it just adds to the allure.
So we've got our 5 victims, a handful of compelling suspects, a slew of cryptic letters, and this whole universe of conspiracy theories. Like, what's the takeaway from all of this? Why, after more than a century, are we still so captivated by the mystery of Jack the Ripper?
I mean, it's a question that's haunted historians and criminologists and even just armchair detectives for generations. Why does it continue to grip our imaginations?
Yeah, it's like, why Jack the Ripper? Why not some other, case from history?
Maybe it's because it's like the ultimate unsolved puzzle, right?
Right.
The Ripper was never caught and his identity was never confirmed, so we're left with these pieces, but we don't have the whole picture. And I think that void kind of invites us to fill it in with our own theories, our own interpretations of the evidence.
Right, like it's almost like a historical Rorschach test,
Yeah.
right? Like we see what we want to see in the shadows
Right.
and the gaps between the facts. And I think the fact that these murders, they took place in such a specific time and place, Victorian London, a world on the cusp of change, like where gaslight and fog shrouded the streets, it just adds to the allure.
Oh, yeah.
So setting that's just ripe for horror and mystery.
For sure.
It's easy to romanticize that era, but as we've talked about, Whitechapel in 1888 was a place of stark contrasts, immense wealth existing right alongside, grinding poverty, scientific advancements alongside deep-seated superstitions. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Ripper case, it kind of embodies those contradictions.
Yeah, and I think it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature, The brutality of the crimes, the seemingly random selection of victims, the audacity of the killer. I mean, it challenges our sense of order and justice.
We want to believe that there's a reason,
Yeah.
a motive, some sort of pattern that we can understand. But with Jack the Ripper, those answers, they remain elusive. And maybe that's the most unsettling aspect of this whole story.
Yeah, I think it reminds us that sometimes there just aren't any easy answers, no satisfying resolutions. The world can be this really chaotic and unpredictable place. And even with all of our modern forensic tools and investigative techniques, I think some mysteries may never be fully solved.
Which brings us back to that initial question, why are we still so obsessed with Jack the Ripper?
Right.
Maybe it's because he represents the unknown, the unknowable, this shattered figure who embodies our deepest fears and anxieties.
Or maybe it's our way of grappling with our own mortality, our own vulnerability, the Ripper's victims, they were ordinary people.
Right.
Just going about their lives and their sudden violent deaths. I think it reminds us that life can be fleeting and fragile.
Yeah, it is a sobering thought, but it's also a reminder, I think, to cherish the present.
Right.
To value the connections we have and to really appreciate the preciousness of life.
And while the Ripper case may never be definitively solved, the pursuit of answers, the desire to understand the motivations behind these horrific acts, I think it continues to drive us. I think it's a testament to the human spirit. That relentless need to make sense of the world around us, even in the face of darkness and uncertainty.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the historical context, the victims, the investigation, the suspects, those intriguing letters, and even delved into, like, the world of conspiracy theories. But, like, as with any good mystery, I think
Yeah.
we're left with more questions than answers.
And that, in a way, is kind of the beauty of it, right? The mystery endures, and it invites us to just continue exploring, to keep searching for those elusive pieces of the puzzle.
So for those of you listening who are, like, really intrigued by this case, we encourage you to do your own deep dive. You know, read the books, watch the documentaries, explore the online forums. You just might uncover a clue that's been overlooked for centuries,
Until then, the question remains, who was Jack the Ripper?
and the mystery lives on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.